Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Storytellers. Tonight, we're going to talk about the career and influence of one of the true giants of this industry, a man who, along with Jack Kirby and John Buscema, sits upon the Mount Rushmore of comic book dynamism. I'm talking about the amazing Gil Kane. Gil Kane was born Eli Katz in Latvia in 1926 and emigrated to the United States at 3 years old in 1929. Along with his dynamic construction of anatomy and his layouts, he was a pioneer of self-publishing with his long-form comic magazine, His Name is Savage, which he published in 1968. He also did what could possibly be called the first graphic novel in 1971, a sword and sorcery sci-fi book called Black Mark, which was published by Bantam Books. Now, to help us break down Gil's amazing career, I thought it would be fun to have someone on that knew him personally and worked with him. Let's welcome the Archbishop of Fun, Gil's former assistant and a man who has drawn a few comics himself, Mr. Howard Chaykin.
Hey, Graham, how are you?
Hey, bud, how are you?
I'm in a good place for some fucking reason. I can't figure out why.
Well, that's a good thing. That's a good thing. So we're going to be talking about somebody you knew personally.
Yeah. I mean, I met Gil when I was 13. I was at a used bookstore called my friend's book, Dave's Bookstore, which was a dump on Ralph Avenue in Brooklyn. I was selling comics to try to turn him over, and he was there buying Will James books. He was Gil was a serious enthusiast for westerns, and he adored the way Will James drew horses.
Mm-hmm.
James was a children's book writer and artist. He did a book called Smokey, which is best remembered, and he was a god figure to me. I was an obsessive for his work. We were all syndicalists in those days, and we were all Julie Schwartz book edited fans, and Kane was my god.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to work for him 5 years later when his assistant died in his sleep, and I was just terrible. I wasn't really available to do any actual work for him.
Who was his assistant before you?
A guy named Tim Battersby, who died at 21 of an undiagnosed heart ailment. We live in a world where we complain about all sorts of various stuffs, but we look back at a time when a guy of 21 could be undiagnosed of a disease that would kill him in his sleep. Think about it.
Wow.
And he was a comer. He was kind of a guy who worked, as so many of the young guys did at that point, in a kind of a modified Wallace Wood inking style, like Wayne Howard, like Ralph, like Dan Adkins, and and he had the potential of being a serious deal. And then 21 just dies in the middle of the night. And in that callousness of boyhood, I called Gil up. I found his number because in those days people just listed their phone numbers in the phone book, and I went to work for him. And he made it clear to me that I had no value. I was utterly worthless. And but I learned everything I know. It's like that old. I learned everything I need to know in the world in kindergarten. Well, in this case, watching Gil Kane work for a year was the single best foundation I could have for the comic book career that I've had. I've done actually more hands-on work working as an assistant for other people. I never talk about the work that I've done for other people until they're dead, so I can now talk about them because they're all dead. But I was in terror that I'd end up like Wallace Wood because I really wanted to end up like Gil Kane. And Gil was a complex and complicated and contradictory guy. He was very difficult. All of the rumors about his misdemeanorish behavior, I won't say larcenous, but I'm thinking it, were true.
Mm-hmm.
He lived way beyond his means. He had a cavalier attitude toward much of the truth. But he was also an astonishing autodidact. I cannot convey that enough. He was a guy with a 10th grade education. Steve Grant has used the phrase retraining in regard to Gil. Steve was also a pal of Gil's, and if you ever want to have someone on the show that's worth talking to, Steve is a great guy to chat with. Gil was a guy who began his career as an assistant at the Simon Kirby shop. Ghosted a couple of either Newsboy Legion or Boy Commanders, I forget which, and they were just terrible. But he was a kid; they were all children back then. He was the least of his generation, And he went through a number of iterations. I mean, he was imitating Jack, and then of course in the late '40s, he was imitating Alex and the Sax and Bernie Sax
Hmm.
and the Barry Boys. Um, and it isn't until he comes under the influence of Bern Hogarth, who I regard as a fraud and a mountebank, um, that he was able to. He was the only guy I've ever known who was able to take anything of value out of Hogarth, and by sifting it through the sieve of George Bridgman, finding an anatomical system, and this coincided with the advent of the Marvel Age of comics in the mid '60s. Now, we've had this conversation both in public and in private. Um, Stan always regarded Gil's work as kind of swishy
Hmm.
in the earlier days because Gil was obsessed with modern dance, and his figures moved like dancers. They were built like dancers. Um, the Much of the conversation that I had with him when I was a kid, when I was 18 and 19, working for him, was about him going to the theater in the late 1940s where you can get it for 50 cents. 50 cents to see Marlon Brando in A Streetcar Named Desire.
Hmm.
And, SRO, but what the hell? Why not? And so much of his work is informed by this. Years ago, when I was married to my second wife, we went to see a show called Dancing, which was a series of spots of re-choreographed bits of business for music done by Bob Fosse. And there was a sequence that did Copeland's Rodeo, which is cowboys. And we were sitting in our usual seats, which is the front row mezzanine of the theater. And these dancers were leaping into the air and they were suspended briefly. And I turned to Leslie and I said, "Holy fuck, these are Gil Kane figures." And it's really what they were. So
Hmm.
much of Gil's choreography is about dance. I think I've told you the story about by the way, if I'm talking too much, cut me off.
I'll interrupt when I'm ready.
When I've been working for him for about 6 months, and he said, we're shutting down for the afternoon. I said, okay. And he had one of those little yellow plastic 9-inch black and white Panasonic TV sets that all of us had in those days.
Hmm.
His was wrapping tape to his drawing table, and we watched a movie, a Columbia 1940 picture called Cover Girl, which I only found out years later was in color. I had no idea.
Hmm.
He annotated the entire movie. This is in the days before there were VHSs or DVDs or anything. There was no recording of any time. It was on 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Channel 5 in New York City, and Channel 9 or whatever. And he annotated the movie for me in great detail, explaining to me why Gene Kelly mattered, why Gene Kelly's use of space as a dancer mattered, how different it was from Fred Astaire. Because I only knew from Fred Astaire, from the RKOs, the musicals,
Hmm.
and which are unwatchable for me today. I can watch the dance sequences, but the films themselves are unwatchable. Whereas the Kelly stuff remains deeply engaging.
Hmm.
And Gil used a phrase that could clearly be applied to his own work, which is the urban cavalier. Kelly danced like a street guy. He
Hmm.
danced like a guy who didn't aspire to top hat and Dales, but was perfectly willing to do it in saddle shoes, chinos, and a sweater. And when I saw Kelly as D'Artagnan in the Pandro S. Berman Louis A. Milestone production of the Three Musketeers from 1948, that was Gil Kane action. That bit where D'Artagnan rolls over the guy's back and then comes in and just impales him on his sword.
Hmm.
That's all that Gil stuff.
It's interesting. You mentioned what Stan thought of his artwork and that he was influenced by dance, and you make the analogy of Fred Astaire versus Gene Kelly. And it's funny, but when Gil was working at DC in the '60s, the '50s and '60s, and then he started doing some work at Marvel. Like I think his first stuff there was like the Hulk in Tales of Suspense, Tales to Astonish. Um, his figures there were, to me, I understood what Stan was saying because it reminded me of more Fred Astaire-ish figures. Whereas
Well, by comparison to Jack, sure.
by the 1970s, when Gil became the preeminent cover artist for Marvel, his figures got a lot grittier, a lot more dynamic and powerful and masculine in their poses and stuff.
Well, look at it this way. I mean, if you agree with me, and I hope you do, that the single greatest gift that Steranko had was to conflate Jack Kirby and Bernie Kriegsteen. Okay, he really did combine those two. Gil's great gift was the transliteration of Jack stuff and Hogarth stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there was
But
there was
The Bridgman mention, I think, goes a long way in explaining his figure development, because
absolutely.
the blockiness and the way that Bridgman would twist and turn figures, you can definitely see that in Kane's work.
But that's also Hogarth as well. Although when Hogarth, I mean, Gil is a perfect example of the guy who transcended his influences. I think he was
Hogarth made shit up. I mean, what the hell is that thing between the ass? He's always
come on. I mean, Hogarth is a mountebank. I mean, he really is. But Gil was deeply intimidated by him because of his intellectualism. Gil was a constant reader, but he never had much of an education. His education was completely self-derived. But he transcended Hogarth as an influence, and to a profound extent, Gil never really accepted the fact that he did transcend that influence. I mean, Gil was, you know, there was a phrase that applied to Charlie Parker: his arrogance enormous, his humility profound, and that to a certain extent that applies it. People, you know, when Gil was so critical of others, no one seemed to remember the fact that he was as critical of himself.
right.
And he was an extremely observant and constant figure. The things that he got wrong were fascinating, and the limitations of his ambition were really interesting, because he was a guy who could articulate. I mean, his speech was fabulous.
Mm-hmm.
He was a guy who taught himself to go beyond the these, thems, and those of his boyhood, because I know exactly where that comes from. I mean, he was raised at 420 Saratoga Avenue in Brownsville. I was raised at 370. We went to the same grammar school 25 years apart. And
he was 3 years old when he moved here. Did he
just in time for the Depression.
Did he have an accent at all, or was his accent pure New York?
He spoke no English until he got street worthy. He was an only child. His parents never spoke English. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, my grandparents could barely communicate on paper. They spoke some English, but you know, when I was a little boy, the language that was spoken around my grandmother's house was Yiddish. It was a mixture of Yiddish and English. You know, there was just so little they could do. Mm-hmm. My grandmother came over here at the age of 18. Gil was here at 3, so he learned English on the street. But his parents, as far as I know, never learned to speak English with any real confidence. And Gil was also a very awkward, gawky. He was 6'1" when he was a kid at 14. And you look at pictures of him from the 40s, because he was working in comics and he got drafted. He never served overseas, but he was in the army like 46 to 47. And you see pictures of him back then, and he looks like where he got his name from. The name Gil comes from Gil Lamb, who was a novelty dance act in vaudeville and in two-reelers back then, who was sort of like a bargain basement Ray Bolger. He resembled Ray Bolger to a certain extent. And Gil had a nose like a toucan, you know. And he got a nose job in the late 40s, early 50s, and took shit for it endlessly. Because he went from being this rather unattractive, you know, just sort of schlump, to a very, very good-looking guy. I mean, he had it going on. You know? Mm-hmm.
And now there's a nose job story here, isn't there?
Well,
that I think you remember telling me when he went into the offices after his nose job. Okay.
All right. He just took in. Well, I did it. I did the thing in Hey Kids Comics. You know, I mean, Alex in that callousness Toth referred to him as he of 3 names and 2 noses. But Alex wasn't one of the great Jew baiters of comics in those days as it is. Gil was the personification of the guy on the make. He was very hungry. He was desperate for money and desperate for attention. And, you know, the first phase of his life is doing Jack. The second phase of his life is doing what everybody at DC was doing. And then when he meets Hogarth changes everything. And that's when he develops the flayed figure, the Bridgman figure, the tectonic plates of muscle.
What year was that he discovered
Probably
Hogarth?
mid 60s.
Oh, that late. Okay.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, his first intellectual influence was the truly awful Robert Kanigher. Kanigher was an extremely well-read guy who demeaned everyone around him.
I've heard that.
He was just an awful person. I mean, there were people who celebrate his death, but Gil was extremely interested in bettering himself, and that bettering himself is something that put a target on his back to a profound degree, because comics, certainly guys of that generation, were united by a kind of self-loathing. They all thought this was a stop on a train that they got stuck on.
Comics.
And the idea that anyone would want to make better of himself seemed diminishing. I mean, he took enormous shit for the nose job. Every single thing he did was a like a torch waved in people's faces. I mean, I told the story. You can't know just how comical it is, how many syllables Mike Esposito could put into the word fans with such loathing and detestment, just like, ugh.
Fans?
Fans. He just, the word fan coming out of Mike Esposito's mouth was filled with just bile. It was amazing. But Gil,
this will make him turn over in his grave. He's dead, right?
He's long dead.
Yeah. Okay. All right. This will make him turn over in his grave because this is my only Gil Kane page, and it's inked by Mike Esposito.
Was it inked by Mike or Mickey DeMeo?
It was Esposito. It's 1974 from Marvel Superheroes number number 1, and it was the first Spider-Man comic I ever bought, and I was a fan of it. So there you go, Espo.
I'm the guy who, I mean, Gil was the one who made me look at Ross Andrew seriously. Okay, because when I was a kid, I loved Andrew and Esposito stuff. I thought it was great, and I loved the stuff they did with Kanigher because it was so utterly batshit. The Wonder Woman stuff they did was nutty. The Metal Men was crazy. Okay, but by the time I became a professional, I sort of like, oh, Ross Andrew, and Gil was Bemish, man, stop it. Look at this shit,
Yeah,
and he was right.
Yeah,
for me, I look at Ross's stuff and I see just the sense of volume, the sense of shape. And I'm one of those people who believes that you can't get what Jose Garcia Lopez is doing today without having put it through the sieve of Ross Andrew. It's prettier.
Garcia Lopez's stuff. The drawings are prettier.
Yeah, but the shape, the volume, the idea is there.
There's 3 guys that can really convey in black and white a sense of depth like nobody else, and that is Ross Andrew, Nick Carty, and Joe Kubert.
I think that's true.
I
think that's absolutely true. I really do. I think Carty gets nowhere near the attention he deserves.
Yeah.
And I can tell you right now, when we were up at Continu, when the pencils were coming in for the Superman and Spider-Man book, first team up, we were absolutely flabbergasted by the work. It was astonishing work. Because Ross took all these photos, and he used his photo reference, and he used it in a way that is not the way we think of photo reference today. I mean, it was a dreamscape reference to the photographs.
Right.
They weren't tried, they were used, and just amazing stuff. And Ross, in the couple of times I met Ross, he was very inarticulate. He was not a guy that you could have an actual conversation with.
Oh, is that right?
It might have been by the fact that I was much younger. There were guys of that generation who couldn't talk to people of my age. They really couldn't, And I went to the guys who could. I went to Russ Heath, and Gil. I never had a relationship with Carmine, but Joe Orlando, Woody, Gray Morrow, those cats. And Gil was extremely forthcoming. I mean, Gil and I didn't speak for no particular reason. We didn't really speak much. We ran into each other at Marvel. And he called me up right after the Flag book was done to say that he felt that I finally answered the call and the promise. I was very grateful. I ran into him at Marvel when the pencils that Mike Golden did for that Avengers annual.
Oh yeah,
And watching Gil lose his shit at these pencils was a revelation because he could not fathom how anyone could produce that sort of work
Mm-hmm.
because he lacked the patience to invest the work in the time that that sort of work called for. And I can
Right.
empathize because I lack that patience myself.
Yeah.
It's one of the reasons why I never became an illustrator and made a comic book artist. So the shorthand nature of comic books is best served by my thinking.
That's the stuff I like. I like the immediacy of it. I like get the story down. Don't put all the surface detail in. It bogs the mind. It bogs the eyes. It's all about the story. Get that story moving. Get that eye going from the next panel.
It's where your taste and mine really converge. I mean, we're both big Crane fans. We're both
Hmm.
big Connections, you know. I mean, for example, I mean, I regard Gil as the single most important male influence in my life in terms of why I am what I do. But there really isn't a profound influence from an artistic perspective
Hmm.
because I don't share his sense of hyperbole. I don't have the operatic qualities that his work has, and I don't think that that I don't think that's a loss on my part. Um, I think to a great extent, Gil would have profited from slowing down, from stepping back, um, and developing a more reasoned and subtle point of view. Um, you know, when I look at the work that Lenny Starr did on Mary Perkins on Stage,
Hmm.
Starr comes out of that DC franchise, that Bernie Sachs, Barry Brothers, Alex Toth, Ruben Morera style of the early
Hmm.
50s. And it would have been lovely if Gil had been able to train himself in that, to retrain himself in that Stephen Grant phrase back in the early 50s, not necessarily in the direction or not exclusively in the direction that um, that he got from Hogarth,
Hmm.
but also in addition in a less hyperbolic, a more accessible human scaled way, if that makes any sense. I mean, I mean, Klaus Janson is a guy that I always thought of as an inker for many years until Klaus
Hmm.
and I ended up working as doing seminars at Marvel twice a year, starting in the early aughts.
Let me just thank Dan for that super chat. Thanks, buddy. Glad that you're here.
Hey
Okay.
Dan, and Klaus pulled up these pencils that he'd done for a Daredevil job that Brian Bendis had written, and I was mind blown. The work was staggering.
Hmm.
It was reminiscent of all the great realistic strips of the 50s. It had elements of Peter Scratch, of Apartment 3G. It was just gorgeous. It was just
Hmm.
really lovely. And I have no idea whether that was the time consumed was such, but it just was beautiful. I look at Gil's stuff and I realize that every single thing that he does comes out of his head.
Hmm.
There's no I mean, we tried, we really did. Don Cameron and I tried to teach Gil how to use reference so that his automobiles wouldn't be generic, so that his cities wouldn't be generic,
Hmm.
that he would find different clothing choices. I mean, you talk about the simple stuff, and one of the ways we support character and narrative in the simple stuff is through character and clothing. A character is often what he's wearing. I'm
Hmm.
not talking about superhero suits. When you look at the Alien Alamo stuff, I mean, you tell a great deal about those characters, who they are, by how they wear the clothes they're wearing.
Hmm.
And Gil had a suit, a hat, a gun, a car, a city. And he wasn't lazy with it. There was nothing lazy about that. But he couldn't see past that generic nature. A
Yeah,
lot of the guys.
even like when he was doing Spider-Man and there'd be street scenes, it didn't look like I think that was around 1971 or
Right,
so, 72. It didn't look like 1971 or 72.
right. It all looked like this, like the 20th Century Fox New York street set.
Hmm.
It never felt that you had a real world to it.
Hmm.
This is also, I mean, it's what that's because he could never get past the mindset of stopping working fast.
Right. And that might go back to, his upbringing. Like you said, he
Oh,
was
absolutely.
always hungry,
Absolutely.
and that
Absolutely.
shit did not pay anything. There was no royalties so these guys, the more he churned out, the more money he made. And
No question. Look, I'm convinced he died owing me money. I have no doubt. But he was also he had his ambitions were very selective. You know, he approached me about doing a massive, big fat version of Gladiator by Philip Wiley. And I reread the book. I read the book, of course, when I was a kid, like we all did. It's one of the seminal canon texts. And what I did was I pushed it 50 years into the future to move it out of the first half of the 20th century, move it to the second. And it worked. It worked really well. I wrote the script. I wrote 4 50-page books, which gave me a lot of room to open up. It was really wide open. And I gave him the script, and he completely freaked on it because it was just too damn much work. Couldn't visualize doing the work involved. Now, I should say, I don't write anything for anybody else that I wouldn't write for myself. Okay, I write full scripts because I haven't delivered pencils in 40 years, so my scripts are very complete, and they're all about size and shape because, as you know, I feel that space represents time in comics, and the script lay there for a while until finally Russ Heath ended up doing a bang up job. I mean, let us not say, but the book was written for Gil. And there is a disappointment in that he never felt up to it. And when I see the work that he did with Roy on the Nibelungen, it's all very generic. There's no sense of specificity about this stuff. It's when I saw Siegfried, for the Fritz Lang sound picture, it brings to mind Gil stuff. But I'd like to have seen something less generic there. I always expected more of his work on John Carter of Mars because I knew how much of his boyhood was informed by reading the pulps. And I think a lot of it is that he stopped reading fiction by the mid '60s. He was reading nothing but criticism and basically just criticism for the most part, not fiction. And he lost touch in his narrative with what he was doing visually and narratively. For a guy who could write essays as effectively as he did, he was a great essayist. He was never able to translate that into a narrative voice in comics. It was always very, very turgid and prolix.
Now, when you were working with him as an assistant, that was right around the time that Black Mark was coming out,
I
right?
was working on Black Mark.
That's what I thought. Okay. Did he write Black Mark, or
No.
was that Ron Goulet?
No, it was Archie Goodwin.
Oh, it was Archie. Okay.
Yeah. I was erasing pages, filling in blanks, pasting up copy, because I wasn't good enough to do anything else. And that's where I met Archie. That's where I met Archie. I met Archie. I met Russ. I met Rich Buckler. He wanted to bring Buckler in to do some layout for him. That didn't pan out. He didn't understand how Buckler worked completely from the outside. There was no internal structure to Buckler's drawing. Buckler started drawing and did a silhouette outline, and he couldn't figure out how that worked in his own head. But that experience introduced me to a lot of people, and it really opened my eyes. I tried to get him to go to a First Friday, but I couldn't get his ass out of the house to come into the city for it. I think he would have felt very uncomfortable, but it might have been a real positive effect on him to spend some time in the company of men half his age. With guys like, because the First Fridays originated at Roy's place. By the time I was going, it was at Jeff's. And I went there and I met, I actually had a real conversation with Gray Morrow as opposed to a fleeting, moment at a show. Roy Krenkel, Kaluta, Wrightson, Weiss, Brunner, Jeff, Wheezy, just Williamson. It was just these guys are gods, and meeting them in a casual atmosphere of a living room, just basically shooting the shit, was an extraordinary education. It really was. But Gil's sense of self had nothing to do with that sort of social behavior. His sense of self was cocktail parties on Friday nights in Westport, with the Westport's cartoonist crowd. He shows up as a minor character in Murphy's book. You've read the Murphy book, right? John Murphy's, the Westport Comics book.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Gil,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Gil was very much a part of that suburban community, and so much of his life was based on chasing a fantasy. I mean, he was ready to go. He was all set to move to California, buy a convertible, and drive down Sunset Boulevard with a blonde and his hair streaming. He was a married man with responsibilities, but
Thanks,
his
Dan.
fantasy life was there. Dan's back.
Dan's back. He's been dropping some super chats and TC. Thank you for the $4.99. Feel like I should be taking notes on this one. Well, notes are a good thing. Do you think did Gil feel because when I look at Gil's work, I see a master, a guy who's very, very confident in his line work and what he's doing. But did Gil feel maybe like he was lesser, or what's the word I'm looking for? Not at the same level as some of those Westport cartoonists like Drake and Star and those guys, that were all out there.
I don't. He was, there are things that he said to me that I could never say in public. That when I see you over food, I'll give you the story because they're horrific. I mean, they're truly horrific. He was a pretty unfiltered guy, Yeah. But I think it was less that than I think he regarded. I think he felt that Jack represented the pinnacle of everything. He really did. And one of those days when I was working for him, he rather casually asked me who I rather liked in comics. One of those innocent sounding phrases that I was blindsided, like a moron I bit, And I got scathed. Just like my tastes were like they were thrown in a bucket and thrown out to sea. I mean, I can't even say some of the things he said. I will get a snot driven laugh for you when I give you some of these things in public. Trust me on this. I'll tell you over meat. It'll be good for you. But some of the less appalling stuff that he said, was he dismissed Gray Morrow as no more than a demonstration of facility, which I found fascinating, and I rejected until I came to realize I understood exactly what he meant. That going right back to what you said about the story serving the narrative, that Gray was a guy who occasionally felt victim to the idea of the elaboration of the image in an almost masturbatory way.
Mm.
He dismissed Neil Adams as making comics safe again for commercial art, which I thought was his.
That's a good line.
It's fabulous. It killed me. But it's a reflection of a guy who refuses to identify the fact that there are other ways to do things.
Right.
And a lot of those guys were enabled. I mean, Eisner could never see past his own style.
Right.
Toth could never. I mean, to his credit, Toth was able occasionally, but with difficulty, to identify guys whose work he admired, like Corbin and like Sienkiewicz. Toth was a big fan of Sienkiewicz. And yet he dismissed a guy like Tony Salmons, who, Salmon's work was extraordinary.
Yeah,
when he was on fire.
Yeah, that Vigilante series he did for DC with the Chiarello covers. Oh my God!
Oh, just fantastic stuff. Apparently a very difficult fit, but the work is great.
Yeah.
But Gil had a really difficult time seeing past this.
Mm-hmm.
He acknowledged Golden for his masterfulness, masterliness, mastrosity. I don't know. Because I'm of the mind that Michael Golden is the most important and influential comic book artist to come into the business in the last 40 years. There are guys who built entire careers out of bits and pieces of Michael Golden's work. Um, and the fact that he's not renowned is a demonstration of a personal choice as opposed to anything else. But Gil, the guys that Gil admired, he loved Ross Andrews stuff. Because he regarded Andrew as just a building block artist who really was able to put it right down. I don't know what he thought about Romita. I couldn't say, but I know that he worshipped Jack just completely. He regarded Jack as the angriest man he'd ever known in his life.
I think that's true.
I never met Jack.
Yeah.
I couldn't.
You didn't?
I don't know.
Huh?
No, I mean, we were never in the same. I've only met Stan 3 times, and 2 of them were just comedy gold. But no, the guys I knew, I knew the Marvel guys, I knew the DC guys in the office.
What did Gil think about John Buscema? Did he ever?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I'm one of those guys who, again, I'm going to make enemies with this one. I know it. I can feel it coming in. I believe that Buscema is grossly overrated. He's overpraised. I think he was an extraordinary draftsman, but from his comic books don't hold any interest in me. They don't have they don't have a lock on me in the way that Kubert's does. And despite my loathing on a personal level for Eisner's work from that in the earlier stuff does for me. Buscema's work feels just whatever. Whereas Gil stuff. I mean, I'm of the mind that at a certain point, Gil was the guy who was working at Marvel, who was carrying on the visual legacy of Jack most effectively. I mean, I'm not a Gene Colan fan. I've always felt that his work lacked an axis, that nobody seemed to be standing on the same ground plane, and the figures didn't seem to have there was a clumsiness about them. Whereas Gil's stuff, I mean, when I was a kid, the Jack Kirby stuff that I got turned on to was the Fly, the Double Life of Private Strong, Challenges the Unknown, and oh Jesus, and the 3 Rocketeers. Okay, and that stuff had great action, great bounce, and just volume, and it was just like so great looking stuff. But by the mid '60s, Jack was working so much that his work had become about impact as opposed to action. And Gil brought back that sense of motion. Look at the physics, and there's Buddy Hackett in the lower right-hand corner.
And there's those 1960s suits.
Right, exactly. All the genericness of it all.
Right.
Just
the hat. I mean, this is a comic from 1980. I'm going to guess 83. Right. It was around the time that he had taken over. And you still got a guy wearing a fedora.
Right. I mean, come on, really. Everything is very generic.
But look at the wrinkles and look at the faces. I mean, I'm willing to overlook that kind of stuff for.
I learned how to. You've got the famous artist books, right? You've got the okay, and there's that great chapter by Albert Dorn about drawing crowds.
No, I don't have those books.
There's one of the in the famous artist books. There's a wonderful sequence by Albert Dorn about doing crowds, and they reproduce on vellum a facsimile of one of his pencil drawings, and it is an absolutely breathtaking example of spatial organization. And in the text, it says, Dorman says, just draw more people. No. I mean, no, it's not. Gil was the guy who really understood the Dorn lessons. When Gil did volumes in mass, he would fill the foreground with figures, and then suggest the rest of those people.
Right.
And they were just little bits and pieces of it. I love that.
Yes.
That's one of the things I definitely learned from him. But look at that Spider-Man. Look at that Spider-Man figure, and you can see the whole darkness of that in that Spider-Man figure.
Gil has had a lot of inkers because he did so much work, and personally, I really like when he inks it himself. I don't necessarily like the materials he used because he sort of had a dead line in his later work. But
I love that graphic effect that he achieved when he inked his own stuff, right?
Yes. And but as far as like his superhero stuff here, when John Romita inked him, it was magic. These two together to me are just like, this is Marvel, from this period. The action, the dynamism, the the
You know,
beautiful
for me,
structure of the figures. You know,
I love Sid Green's inks on him back in the day on Green Lantern. I love that stuff. But for me, for what I love most, my favorite aspect of this stuff is that string of Western covers he did for Marvel throughout this.
Yes. Oh, I got one here. Hold on.
I am absolutely batshit about it. Oh,
look at that.
I mean, look at that. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, Gil was
There's
so
so
obsessed.
much going on here. I mean, you've got our focus on our main character. You got our foreground figures with the guns, intimating, you know, what's happening, and then you got the reflections of the dudes in the water.
Well, I mean, a couple of months ago, in the course of the Subjective Lockdown Film Festival, we watched a Sidney Lumet picture from the 1960s called Bye Bye Braverman, which was George Segal, Jack Warden, a whole slew of character actors trying to find a funeral. And at one point in the movie, at the end of the movie, Jack Warden is talking to his mother and yells out to George Segal, "We're getting together next week for the Randolph Scott Film Festival, right?" And all I could think of was Gil, because Gil was absolutely and completely obsessed with the Fords, the Bedekers, and the Manns, those westerns.
Mm-hmm.
He thought that the stuff that Anthony Mann did with Jimmy Stewart was breathtaking, and you know, and he mocked other artists in their attempts to do westerns. He felt that he'd invested so much energy in it, and his westerns had nothing to do with even anything even vaguely historically accurate. It was all about Republic, Monogram, and Columbia, 1935 to 1950. That's all it was, and that's what informs my entire sensibility of that work.
Sure. I mean, none of us lived during that period, so none of us can really say what was completely accurate. So that's the beauty about westerns, is that you can interpret them in certain ways. Even Tarantino, you know, had in Django Unchained, he's got guys wearing, you know, modern day suede outfits and stuff, and it all works. You know,
Well,
Robert Conrad in Wild Wild West, you know, with his little tight ass.
Look, before we went on camera, we were talking about Warlock. Imagine what a comic book adaptation of Warlock would look like if Gil had drawn it.
Right?
The operatic nature, the apocalyptic nature of that material, right?
Yeah.
Just insane.
And nobody, John Buscema might be the only one who can draw horses as good as Gil, because just like his human figures, they're so damn dynamic. His horses have personality.
It brings to mind what he said about Frazetta.
Oh.
He dismissed Frazetta as drawing horses that all looked like they fell off a carousel, which I thought was fantastic. He was so venal, so petty.
Wow.
Yeah. And there was more, but the rest of it we'll have to say till when we have some food.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, look at this inking here. It's really simple.
Yeah.
You know.
This is when he was still using traditional materials, though. This is definitely pen and ink.
Yes, but he was really inept with the crow quill. He was using the speedball. Yeah, because he had no sense of thick or thin. You know.
Yeah, because you look at the line work here on this foot. You know.
Right.
It's a little clunky looking.
Yeah. You know, but then you look at Green Lantern's left hand. I mean, look at that.
Oh.
Man.
That's the first thing I noticed is that,
right? I mean,
that nuance in the hand.
Right?
That is killer. Yeah, even this here, even the Pie Face's
right.
hand on the shoulder here. That's just and this here.
Well, he was still doing exercises till he died. You know, he was still doing that, you know, warm up every day. He would sit there and he would copy Bridgman. He would copy Willie Pagani. He was fanatically obsessed with Willie Pagani stuff. You know Pagani's work, right?
Mm-mm.
Oh, you'd like his work. Dover republished his a collection of. Hold on a second. Stay there. Don't go.
All right. I will share this other cool cover. This looks like it was inked by Klaus Janson. And I love the power of this cover. Now, this element, this design element, has been used a million times with the guy in the dinosaur mouth. But this one, to me, you can feel the pressure, you know, the pressing of the muscles of of the Black Panther pushing that mouth open there, the hand placement here. There's so much great stuff going on in this drawing, even if the dinosaur is kind of goofy looking.
I mean, his stuff. Jack Adler once dismissed his work as being no more than mathematics, and I just said, Jack, you're so full of shit. It's unbelievable. I mean,
That's what he said about Gil, that his work is mathematical.
Yes. But what it comes down to is, it goes back to what we've discussed more than once, which is Gil's work was profoundly graphic. He designed the figure to support the narrative and design. His realism was more about the flayed figure of detail, but his action. Look at the shape, the line you can draw from his left hand to right hand right there. Just the series of triangles created in the picture. It's incredibly dynamic.
Oh yeah.
I only wish he had answered his own ambition and sought out material and an approach to the material that would have elevated his stuff just the slightest bit. But he worked so quickly and was so up against it financially that he could never have done that.
Right.
I'm sure he died in debt. There's no. I don't doubt it for him there.
Aaron Lepresti says Gil Kane was the greatest cover artist of the 70s. Just saying.
I'd say that's pretty true. I would tend to agree with you, Aaron. Yeah, I would. I'd say that's so. And again, right back for me, it's all about those westerns. That they just killed me. They really did. What I find fascinating. My three favorite cover artists are Reed Crandall's run on the Black Hawk and military stuff, Harvey Kurtzman's war books, and Dave Johnson's work over the past 15 years. And to a great extent, what Gil was doing on a lot of those Western covers really could have been breakdown layout for what Kurtzman was doing back at EC and Frontline and Two Fisted. Mm-hmm. They were a bit more melodramatic, but they had the design. And Gil just really put those covers together. And what I find fascinating is he's one of the rare guys who is as good as he is on covers as he is interior.
Yes, and that is a rarity. There's Jack Kirby. To me, a lot of his covers just fall flat. When he hits it out of the freaking park, like Fantastic Four number 12, with the Hulk standing behind that wall as the Fantastic Four is walking to you. There's certain covers that he just kills it on, but he was more about the story. He didn't want to have to stop and do a cover. He was busy churning out pages, so maybe his thought process wasn't the same. But guys like Nick Hardy, look those Batlash covers. Oh my God. The Joe Kubert, the war covers and the what's the Unknown Soldier.
See, for me, Kirby's covers in the 40s and 50s, when they were simpler and graphicer, really worked for me. I mean, the Manhunter covers that he did, the Fly stuff, a lot of white space, a lot of open negative space. But Gil's Western covers were incredibly busy, and yet they held together graphically. Mm-hmm. They were a pinnacle career work for him.
Yeah, and his wrinkles, the clothing, like the jackets and stuff. And I still study that. It's like, oh my God, this is so great. There's another one. I actually saw this original at Tom Palmer's house. He had the original in a flat file.
Right.
Oh my God, I was like, gee, Tom, this might just have to walk out with me.
I've forgotten that Tom did any inks on him,
Yeah. He did a couple of them.
He was deceptively easy to ink.
Gil?
He was not easy looked because unless if he was inking himself, he could maintain that graphic nature. Mm-hmm. But I could see him, today, inked by someone like Chris Samney, or Paulo Rivera. Those guys with that strong graphic sensibility. But it's hard to interpret his stuff as realistic. It just doesn't read realistically. It's so operatic and hyperbolic in its presentation.
Yeah, which made it perfect for 70s comics because that's what we're dealing with.
Right, exactly.
This looks like it was colored by Tom Palmer too.
I think that might be true.
Yeah, because Tom had a really great color sense. But, and I love this cover. Again, another great horse. It's that great horse, but it's got a creepiness about it and dynamic. And he was all about the big figures too, particularly on the covers. He knew what would sell that book. You don't want to see a tiny figure of Spider-Man in the background fighting in this beautifully rendered city. Who gives a shit? I want to see Spider-Man in the foreground, and just intimate that there's a city in the background because I want the figure on the cover.
Well, I mean, again, it goes back to him having a really strong graphic sense, and and again, I don't know where that graphic sense came from. I just don't, because I mean, he didn't apply. His stuff, his covers don't look like Jack's stuff. They don't look like Alex's stuff. They're very much of his own kind, and and I love this stuff. Again, it's I talk a lot about Gil. I tell a lot of Gil Kane anecdotes, and I think people expect me to be deeply influenced by him, but the influence is more about work ethic, about sitting down and doing the job, about being available to the material, and having some ambition. Visually speaking, I was influenced by John Safran as I am by Gil Kane. I mean, people don't seem to notice how much Safran there is in my work. It's a huge amount of Safran work there. I look at his stuff a lot. I mean, my idea of the perfect comic book for me is Alex Toth influencing layout, and Wallace Wood influencing the world, and John Safran influencing the people in that particular realm. I mean, for me, when I was a kid, I wanted to be Gil Kane when I grew up because I really wanted to do superhero comic books. But when I became a working professional, I realized A, that my skill set wasn't up to it, and B, when my skill set finally got up to the work, I wasn't interested in that sort of work anymore, particularly. And I wasn't smart enough and good enough to do the kind of research involved to be a war comics artist. I just didn't have the skill set at that point. And so I started drawing, real people doing real things. And ultimately, today I can do a war book because I understand how to use research and do the work for it. And so much of what separates me from Gil is that commitment to reference, is that understanding of the application of real world visuals to what you're doing, to get away from the generic. Gil wants to dismiss Karma and is drawing pistols that look like they fired chiclets, which has you bastard. I have no Mount Rushmore. I don't believe in that. I think that my tastes are constantly evolving and changing, and but it's a reasonable question. I mean, in terms of best stuff, favorite stuff, comics guys always use the word best when they mean favorite. And so much of our favorites derive from from our boyhood, because really the golden age of comics really is 12. When I was a little boy, it was all about Gil Kane, Carmine Infantino, Joe Kubert, and Alex Toth. And then I discovered the Marvel age. It was like, oh, Marvel comics, oh, and then Gil turned me on to Jean-Claude Messier, the guy who did Valerian, and he turned me on to Jean Giraud, who did Blueberry, before he was Mobius, he was Jean Giraud.
Right.
And my first job working for him, my first day, was cutting up issues of Pilote and Spirou. He also turned me on to Robert McGinnis. He had a huge file on McGinnis' stuff. He was obsessed with McGinnis' drawing of women. Gil never felt he drew an attractive woman. He felt that his women really fell short. And I don't quite know why, because I don't think they did. But he had a very evolved sense of self. He was proud of who he was. He was proud of the work that he did. But I think, as Graham said, as you said earlier, I don't think he ever held himself in any particular high esteem. He died never thinking he had transcended his influences. And you and I are surrounded by guys in the comic book business who are convinced in their world tallest midgetness that they've transcended their influences. And you'll excuse me, but no, sorry, you have not.
Hey, I celebrate my influences. I do.
Yeah. I stand on the shoulders of giants.
Yeah. Hell, I do this show about my influences.
And look, it's Gil Kane, Wallace Wood, Gray Morrow, Neil Adams, and Joe Orlando, who taught me how not to get beaten the shit out of by Carmine Infantino. Joe was one of the best guys ever. He was just an absolutely stand-up cat.
Yeah.
Who identified from word to one that Carmen had it in for me because I was a pal of Gil's, and they hated each other when they were kids. And
Oh.
and Joe just basically said, "Keep your head down. Don't do anything stupid. You know, you'll be fine." He just one of the best guys ever. True.
Well, now
You know,
this is a perfect opportunity to dovetail into one of my favorite stories you told me, and it involves the death of
you might
the
want to ask if my
beloved
wife's
Frank Giacoya.
ah.
Because you mentioned Carmine.
I will close with this one. Yes,
Yeah,
indeed.
I'm setting you up for a perfect close here.
I mean, I remember telling you this story and getting a laugh out of you that almost had meat coming out of your nose. It was worth it. Okay. All right. Okay. So Frank Giacoya is one of the most beloved guys in comics. Everybody loved Frank. Frank was also an oddly lazy guy. Frank rarely penciled his own stuff. When he was the guy he did 2 strips, and Jack Ghost did a lot of the work that he did on Sherlock Holmes and on The Blue and the Gray. And
thank you, Here Comics. Appreciate it.
Thanks, man. So Frank dies suddenly. And
Frank was also an incredible inker, though. He made everybody he ink look good.
He preferred inking to penciling. He just hated penciling. And
yeah.
Frank dies. I'm having lunch with Gil, and Gil is clearly distraught because I think Frank's death was a statement about his own impending mortality. And Gil says, "I think it's time for me to make peace with everybody." And I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well, I'm a difficult guy." He was not unself-aware. I mean, let's be real. He knew where he was coming from. So, okay, I'm going to do this, And I was living in Los Angeles at the time. Gil was living on the west side. I was on the east side. And so I called him up. I said, about a month later, I said, "We haven't eaten. Let's get together for a meal." So we get together for a meal. And I said, so we're eating. So I said, "So Frank dies. You go off on an amends tour." He said it's been fantastic. He said it was a phenomenal, a growth experience. It was amazing. Just everything about it was great. And there's a momentary pause, and he says, "Except for that fucking Carmine, never." It was the best. Because basically you got to hold on to some shit. You just can't let it go.
Not you can't purge all your shit. It's as simple as that.
Character defects, in my belief, character defects are never removed. We are rather given a filter through which we can avoid having them displayed for others, and recognize the fact that part of our lives is to not behave like the assholes we are inside. As I said to someone recently, I hate the fact that at 71 years old, and I'm an old man, I'm 71, I still react every question asked to me. Before I answer any question, the answers that come to my mind, whatever the question may be, are 11 and your mother. It's always I can't help myself. Graham, thanks so much, man.
Howard, it's always a pleasure having you on, buddy.
Hey, when am I going to see you? When are we going to eat? We haven't eaten in the longest time.
Are you doing cons again?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
I've done a whole bunch. I did Portland. I did Seattle. I did Dallas with Mark Walters. I was in a show in Granada in Spain.
Oh, cool.
I'm doing a couple of shows you and I have done together.
Oh, good.
Are you hitting in the road at all?
I have nothing scheduled right now because I'm deep up to my elbows in getting ready for fulfillment for Alien Alamo. So
I love the fact when you say the word fulfillment, it brings up so many vulgarities that I will never ever indulge in public, but I will do for you. Well,
we have a lot of stories to tell then, because this is going to be some dinner.
but I look forward to it. It's been a long time. You and I, we operate from different sides of the trough, but to a great extent, we meet on meat, and we definitely have time.
Well, you know what? Grown-ups, adults can disagree on ideology and things like that, but grown-ups come together with the things that they do share, the things that they love together. So.
So, and again, I one more time, don't miss Black Book, and let me know when you see it, because it will blow your mind. It's so good.
Okay. I will text you and tell you my thoughts. Great.
Thanks, man.
Thanks again, bud.
All you guys, thanks so much for all your comments. Thanks again, Graham. Behave, stay warm. Have a great holiday.
Thank you.
Don't do anything stupid. If you do, let me know, because the video rights will be worth a fortune.
We'll see ya. He froze up. So I'm just going to pop through some of the chats here that I didn't get a chance to. There he goes. Okay. Let's see. Aaron was in here. Fraga was here. Thank you so much, guys, for popping in. I hope you enjoyed this stuff. Howard's always a great guest. Daryl Wayne, Gil Kane with Klaus Janson inking on Daredevil. My favorite Gil Kane work. Yeah, that's a good pairing. Tom Palmer too, and but I love Ramita on him. You know. Let's see. Charlie Lee says Gil Kane is one of the best artists at drawing foreshortening figures. The king of foreshortening master. And he's a master of the figure, period. That's for sure. Rob Smith says, great program. Kane is hard to cover in such a short time. That's for sure. Trevor, Howard was one of my first guests on this show about almost a year ago to the day. So go to the homepage, on my channel on YouTube, and you can still watch it. They're all archived there. And it reminds me, I always forget to tell you guys, if you're new to the channel, please go subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything, and it helps the program. And hit those like buttons. If you like the show, hit the thumbs up. If you didn't like it, hit the thumbs down. But it still helps with the algorithm. So there's some new faces and names here. So please go do that for me, so I can keep bringing these kind of shows to you, because it takes a lot of time. Oh, I did that one. Kane inking himself is his fave. Oh, stat 0. Yeah, thank you. Manliest man in comics, Mr. Bo Smith is here. Thanks, Bo. Dave Righteous. All right, guys. I'm going to chime out here. But before I go, I just want to tell you that tomorrow night on The Professionals, we're going to be talking about our favorite holiday movies, and it'll be on Billy Tucci's channel. So you're going to want to catch that. Next week, Monday is Monday Monsters. And last week I discussed the Marvel boom of monster comics. And this week I'm going to discuss the DC comics. Oh, NRG Comics, thank you for the $10 super chat. That's a good cigar. Fantastic installment of the Storytellers. Loved hearing you interview Howard Chaykin about Gil Kane. Great stories. Thank you, brother, and thanks for tuning in. So Monday we'll be talking about the DC versions of comics. As Stat Zero said, DC ate their lunch when it came to that stuff, and we'll talk about that, and I'll show some really cool artwork from that period. And let's see, that's Monday. And then next Wednesday for the Storytellers, Larry Stroman is going to be on. So you don't want to miss that. Larry's an incredible artist, and he reached out to me today, and we're setting up for next Wednesday. So that's what we have on tap right now. And hopefully all you guys will come on over to Billy's channel tomorrow night for the Professionals. We'll be imbibing in holiday cocktails and discussing our favorite holiday movies. That should be very interesting. So everybody, thanks again. You guys have a great night. And as always, thanks so much for tuning into the Storytellers. And we shall see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.